They say the air in Manhattan tastes different when snow is falling. Cleaner, sharper, carrying a promise of silent wonder. But up here, 5 stories above the glittering street. At the annual Vance Christmas Gala, the air tasted only of expensive fear. It was a golden prison, the Vance Penthouse. Every crystal flute, every note from the imported jazz band. Every embroidered napkin was a thread in the magnificent tapestry of Malcolm Vance's control. Imani Harper, 6 months pregnant and standing near the edge of the sprawling marble living room, knew that tapestry was woven with lies. Her entire life for the past 3 years had been a performance to maintain the lie of the perfect, powerful Vance family. And tonight, with the festive lights reflecting in the icy windows, that performance was reaching its grotesque finale. The pressure inside Imani was physical. A nauseating mix of the baby's weight, the cloying scent of pine and cinnamon, and the silent scream trapped beneath her ribs. She was Malcolm's prize, his most beautiful and visible asset, meant to reflect his success. But she was breaking. Her hand rested instinctively on her belly, a gesture both protective and weary. She was wearing a gown that cost more than most people's annual salaries. A shimmer of emerald green that contrasted starkly with the colorless terror in her eyes. Every guest here was a player in Malcolm's financial game, investors, politicians, rivals. They weren't looking at Imani the woman. They were assessing the value of the Vance dynasty. And that value, Imani knew, hung precariously on 2 things: the continued illusion of her happy marriage, and the fate of the unborn child she carried. The very air she breathed felt tight because she understood a chilling truth that none of the tuxedoed or sequined guests could comprehend. The opulence around them was a carefully constructed veneer, and beneath the polished surface, Malcolm Vance was drowning, and he intended to take her with him. His charm, his effortless authority was all a brilliant camouflage. She caught his eye across the room as he spoke with Senator Hayes, his expression radiating confident power. The instant his gaze met hers, the mask slipped for a microscopic fraction of a second. She saw the cold, demanding edge in his eyes, a silent order smile. Look happy. Look like you belong to me. He wasn't just intoxicated by the expensive whiskey. He was intoxicated by his own paranoia and desperation. His empire, built swiftly and ruthlessly, was facing catastrophic failure. A whisper she had only pieced together from hushed phone calls and frantic document shredding. The loss wasn't just about money. It was about the loss of control, which, for Malcolm, was a fate worse than death. His financial ruin hinged critically on the timeline of their son's birth and a clause, a dark, intricate clause buried deep within the prenuptial agreement he had forced her to sign. This wasn't merely a contract. It was a cage he had built around her life and potential inheritance. The clause stipulated that if they separated, or if Imani were deemed mentally incapacitated before the child was 1 year old, the majority of the marital assets Imani's own substantial family trust had indirectly funded would be locked up, fully reverting to Malcolm's exclusive control, cementing his position just long enough to weather the incoming financial storm. But the real, terrifying motivation was the life insurance policy. She had overheard the numbers during a late night argument he thought she was sleeping through. A secondary policy taken out recently, naming him as the sole beneficiary, tied subtly to the pregnancy, a colossal $50 million. This was not insurance for the future. It was a desperate exit plan. A sudden, tragic accident involving his distressed, pregnant wife would not only consolidate his control over their shared wealth, but the insurance payout would inject enough immediate liquidity to save his crumbling firm from public collapse. The lie of the evening was breathtaking in its cruelty. They were celebrating Christmas, celebrating their future. But every smile Malcolm offered was a hammer blow intended to shatter her existence. Imani suddenly felt the need to escape, the air turning thick and poisonous. She slipped away, making her way toward the balcony doors, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't want air that smelled like artificial cinnamon and expensive cologne anymore. She wanted oxygen that wasn't tainted by her husband's monstrous ambitions. Outside, the glass balcony rails felt cool against her palm, a momentary relief. The snow was a delicate curtain between the oppressive warmth of the penthouse and the cold indifference of the city. She stood breathing deeply, trying to focus on the distant sound of a passing police siren. Anything to ground her away from the manufactured happiness inside. That siren was a sound of the real world, a world where actions had visible consequences. Unlike Malcolm's enclosed kingdom, where consequences were merely things to be bought off or destroyed. She heard the rhythm of his approach even before she saw him, the heavy, proprietary stride of a man who believed the floor was a courtesy extended solely for his use. Malcolm stepped out, the closing of the sliding door silencing the jazz quartet instantly, isolating them in a bubble of cold air and raw hostility. He had discarded the smooth smile he used for his investors. His face, flushed and tight, was a roadmap of rage and the chilling certainty of entitlement. "Imani," he said, his voice low, controlled, yet containing the vibrating threat of thunder. "Guests are asking, where is the mother of my heir? You know what they think when you disappear?" He leaned against the railing, his custom suit blending with the darkness, transforming him from a suave host into a menacing silhouette. "They think there is trouble in paradise. They think the Vance image is cracked. And if the image is cracked, my credit lines get nervous. Your behavior is actively depreciating my assets, Imani." He always spoke of her in terms of valuation. She was never a wife, a partner, or a woman. She was an asset, a financial tool, a decorative piece meant to validate his status. The cruelty of his words cut deeper than any physical blow, because they laid bare the transactional truth of their entire marriage. "I am pregnant, Malcolm," she replied, keeping her voice even dangerously calm. She knew the moment her fear sounded real, he would pounce. "I needed fresh air." "The party is overwhelming," Kay chuckled, a short, dry, humorless sound that scraped against her nerves. "Fresh air. Or are you simply displaying your patented resistance? You cannot stand to be seen supporting me, can you? After everything I have given you, this life, this security, the entire world at your feet. You repay me by looking miserable." He closed the distance between them, and the scent of expensive whiskey and desperation intensified. "We have a child on the way. You have responsibilities. You signed a contract. You will smile. You will support me. You will be the perfect wife until this messy business is settled." His mention of the contract, the prenuptial agreement, was the icy dagger. He wasn't referencing marital fidelity. He was citing the clause that held her freedom and her child's future hostage. He was reminding her that her role was nearing its expiration date and he needed her compliance now more than ever. "The messy business," Imani challenged softly, finally letting a sliver of defiance enter her voice. "Are you talking about your failing investment fund? Or the $50 million life insurance policy you took out on me last month?" The effect of the words was immediate and terrifying. Malcolm's face went utterly blank, the flush of alcohol draining away, leaving him pale and instantly sobered by cold fury. His composure shattered. The question was a direct threat to his entire catastrophic scheme. It proved she knew too much. The information she possessed was not just damaging. It was potentially criminal. The line between control and outright murder had just dissolved. The silence that descended was heavier than the snow falling around them. It was a vacuum, broken only by the frantic beat of Imani's heart. Malcolm's eyes narrowed, shifting from the calculated rage of a controlling husband to the predatory calculation of a cornered animal. All pretense of the Christmas lie vanished. This was the moment of truth. This was no longer about a party or a public image. It was about $50 million and the survival of his empire. "You heard too much," he whispered, the words sounding dry and brittle. He didn't deny the insurance policy. The truth was too undeniable to waste time on small denials. "You should have stayed silent, Imani. You should have played your part. Do you truly believe that after everything I've built, I would let an emotional, unstable woman destroy me? You are not just a liability to my image. You are a risk to my liquidity." He reached out and seized her wrist, his grip painfully tight. His fingers, which usually controlled boardrooms and signed multi-million-dollar deals, were now intent only on crushing her. The clause is ironclad. You leave me, you get nothing, and I keep the assets necessary to save the firm. But if something tragic were to happen tonight, it's an accident caused by the icy balcony and your well-documented emotional instability, my problems disappear completely. The assets are safe, the firm is saved, and the board is satisfied. Imani didn't fight his grip instantly. She stared up at him, the cold realization of his total moral bankruptcy freezing her fear into resolve. "You think you can get away with it?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. "You think everyone will believe that I, 6 months pregnant, slipped on snow 5 stories up on Christmas while you were standing right here? They will believe what I tell them to believe," Malcolm retorted, his voice regaining strength, bolstered by his terrifying self-confidence. "I control the narrative. I control the media. I control the witnesses inside that room. They are all desperate for my goodwill. You are just a fragile, emotional woman who couldn't handle the pressure of the Vance name. It's the perfect suicide, Imani. Tragically expected." But as he spoke, Imani was subtly moving, using the pain in her wrist to anchor her focus. She wasn't fighting him. She was measuring the distance, the angle, the one chance she had. She had already seen the end of this conversation. He had admitted his plan. He had confessed the $50 million motive. He would not let her walk back inside. He couldn't risk her whispering the truth to anyone, especially not the head of security who controlled the penthouse cameras. This balcony was going to be the scene of her death. He gave her arm a violent shake, intent on pushing her to the railing. "You should have stayed inside, Imani. Now you've made your final decision." "No," she whispered, her eyes burning with a sudden, desperate defiance. "You made the final decision when you signed that insurance policy." She used the momentum of his shake, pulling back slightly just as he shoved forward, not toward the railing, but toward the corner where the glass met the concrete wall. She twisted, her feet slipping not on snow, but on the cold, hard reality of his intent. Her scream was instantaneous, tearing through the icy air. It wasn't a scream of pain, but a primal, desperate shriek of sheer terror and betrayal as his strong, determined hand connected squarely with her shoulder, throwing her entire weight backward. The moment of the fall was a sensory explosion, the sickening rush of air, the golden lights of the penthouse shrinking above her, the cold darkness of the Manhattan night rushing up to meet her. The 6 months of pregnancy made her heavier, slower, yet she was aware of every agonizing rotation. She saw her life flash not as sentimental memories, but as a sequence of Malcolm's calculated manipulations. Her only thought, her fierce, singular focus, was the life beating inside her, not the baby. "He won't take the baby." She instinctually twisted, a primal reflex to shield her belly from the inevitable impact, turning her body so her shoulder and the curve of her back would take the brunt of the 5-story plummet. She felt the wind tear at her emerald dress, heard the whoosh of air past her ears, and saw the blurred outlines of the brick buildings rushing by. The pavement was a solid, uncompromising black target. In that horrifying free-fall fraction of a second, the prenuptial clause, the $50 million policy, and Malcolm's shattered empire faded into irrelevance. Only the fall and the child mattered. And then, just as her body surrendered to the gravity, readying itself for the shattering finality of concrete, there was a deafening metallic crunch. It wasn't the hard, sharp stop of the pavement. It was a yielding, expensive impact that felt less like an end and more like a bizarre, violent cushioning. Her back connected with a solid, resilient mass. There was the sound of groaning metal, shattering glass from a windshield, and the sickening deflation of an airbag deploying with explosive force. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs in a massive, painful gasp, But her body, angled exactly as she had twisted it, did not hit the hard ground. She had landed on something impossibly resilient. Something expensive and strong. The world went momentarily dark, filled with the acrid smell of burning plastic and gunpowder from the deployed airbag. The sudden stop caused a dizzying whip shock, but she was alive. The scream of the car alarm, now piercing and insistent, replaced her own lost cry. She lay crumpled on the massive caved-in hood of a vehicle, a luxurious, solid machine that had been parked directly below the Vance penthouse. Balcony, the sheer improbability of the situation, struck her before the pain did. What were the odds? She had been falling certain of death and had landed on the only cushion capable of saving a fall from that height. And then, as her eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the hazy streetlights, she saw the license plate, a custom vanity plate that had once been a familiar, cherished sight in her past. It was a cryptic sequence of letters and numbers that belonged to only one man. The same man who, years ago, had promised to save her from her father's manipulations. The car that had broken her fall. The vehicle that had defied fate and malice belonged to her ex-fiancé. The former tech billionaire she hadn't spoken to in 3 years, the man Malcolm had worked so hard to erase from her memory. The universe, it seemed, had a deeply ironic $50 million answer for Malcolm Vance's lies. Above the scene, the chaos in the Vance penthouse was a mirror image of the destruction below. The guests, already startled by Imani's scream, rushed to the balcony. Malcolm stood frozen, his eyes wide with a horror that was entirely selfish. He wasn't horrified by the act. He was horrified by the sheer, devastating failure of his plan. The scream had cut through the jazz and the champagne, and the loud, persistent blast of the car alarm now echoed up the 5 stories. A dissonant chorus of doom. He leaned over the railing, peering down through the falling snow, his mind racing not to Imani's safety, but to the legal implications. No body on the concrete. The car alarm screaming. The crowd gathering. The accident was now a public spectacle, and worse, a failure. He had failed to secure the $50 million. He had failed to control the situation. Slipped. He muttered to himself, the words already taking shape into his fabricated narrative. The snow. She was distraught. She was unstable. But the guests below, now leaning over the ornate balcony, were whispering something he couldn't quite make out. Something about a car, about movement, about life. His head of security, a nervous man named David, rushed out. "Sir, what happened?" "The cameras. I told you to delete the balcony feed immediately." Malcolm hissed, his voice lethal. "Do it now. Blame the snow. Blame her emotional state. Tell them she was suicidal. Just get rid of the evidence and secure that prenuptial agreement." His mind latched on to the one stable point, the contract. The $50 million was likely lost. But he could still leverage the prenuptial clause and the instability angle to lock down the shared assets before. Imani could speak. He forced himself back inside, shoving past stunned, whispering guests. He had to assume she was alive. If Imani was alive, he needed an immediate, total narrative lockdown. He needed a witness, an accomplice, who would publicly attest to her fragility. He found Tanisha Boyd, impeccably dressed and already positioning herself near the Christmas tree, radiating an aura of concerned compassion that was entirely feigned. Tanisha, his longtime confidant and aspiring replacement wife, understood the delicate dance of power and image. She had always wanted Imani's place, and now she saw her opportunity. Not just as Malcolm's lover, but as his public, sympathetic anchor in a time of manufactured crisis. Malcolm commanded, grabbing her arm with a desperate urgency. She was unstable. You saw her earlier. You saw how emotional she was, right? Tell the others. Tell them she was talking about the pressure, about how she couldn't handle the pregnancy. We need a united front. We need the narrative to be suicide or accident. It was the snow, Tanisha. The snow. Tanisha's eyes flashed with a disturbing blend of shock at the violence and exhilaration at the opportunity. This was her audition for the role of the matriarch. "Of course, Malcolm," she cooed, her hand placed perfectly on his chest. We all saw how fragile she was. She needed professional help. "This is a tragedy, but it's not your fault. You tried so hard to keep her stable. I'll make sure everyone understands that." But her words were already too late. The car alarm was still screaming, and the custom license plate, Quentyn's plate, was about to introduce a massive, dangerous variable into Malcolm's carefully constructed equation. The lie of the perfect Christmas was dead, shattered not by a fall, but by a miraculous, impossibly timely intervention. The guests were a study in divided loyalty and sudden panic. One group remained huddled near the bar, sipping champagne and frantically whispering about stock prices and potential damage control, fearful of being associated with the rapidly escalating scandal. The other group, morbidly drawn to the unfolding street spectacle, reported the details from the balcony. "She moved. I swear I saw her hand move. It's a black Mercedes, a very old Model Rare GT. Who owns a car like that around here?" Malcolm is denying everything. He says she slipped because of instability. But that sound? That was a deliberate push. The whispers of push were the cracks in Malcolm's facade. He tried to project controlled grief, but his eyes darted constantly toward the balcony, assessing the damage. His focus shifted entirely from saving Imani to protecting the $50 million he hoped to salvage through the prenup. The clock was ticking. If Imani was conscious, she could speak. If she spoke before his legal team locked down the assets, everything was lost. He returned to Tanisha, pulling her into an alcove. "Get my legal team here now," he demanded, his voice a gravelly whisper. "I need the separation papers drafted immediately," citing her emotional instability and the accidental fall. "Before the police can speak to her, the legal action must be underway. It proves my narrative. She was fragile, and I was trying to manage the situation gently before the child arrived." Tanisha, still basking in the glow of her promoted role, nodded swiftly. "I'm on it. I'll make sure the separation filing is the first thing the media sees. They'll believe the unstable wife narrative." But the noise from the street below intensified. The high-pitched wail of police sirens and ambulance lights now strobed through the penthouse windows, bathing the marble floors in frantic blue and red. The authorities were arriving. Then the time for narrative control was rapidly running out as the first two uniformed ARD officers stepped out of the elevator. Followed by a pair of paramedics, the conversations in the room froze entirely. The officers didn't stop for Malcolm's smooth, rehearsed welcome. They went straight to the head of security, who pointed towards the balcony. The lead paramedic, a young woman with a focused, serious demeanor, turned to Malcolm after a brief radio conversation. "Mr. Vance, your wife is alive. She is being stabilized now. We need information on her medical history." The word alive hung in the air, a physical force that knocked the breath out of the room again. Tanisha's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes betraying genuine panicked shock. Malcolm swayed, his composure finally fracturing completely. He had been so certain, so committed to the finality of the fall. Alive meant she would talk. Alive meant the $50 million and his financial redemption were gone, replaced by criminal charges. She must be confused," Malcolm stammered, pointing at the balcony. "She slipped. The snow. She's hysterical. You have to believe me, officer, she's been very distressed." The paramedic, however, cut him off with a chilling professional calm. "We are aware of the situation." Before losing consciousness, she was able to state her condition and mention one name. "She is asking for Quentyn Rhodess." The name dropped like a lead weight, stunning the room into utter silence. The two police officers exchanged a look that spoke volumes. The guests gasped, looking from Malcolm, now pale and sweating, to the balcony, and then back to the closed elevator doors. The $50 million plot had just collided head-on with the ghost of Imani's past. The revelation of Quentyn's name, coupled with the news of Imani's survival, was the moment Malcolm Vance's entire life unraveled. The police were already suspicious, and the mention of an ex-fiancé especially a highly public figure like Quentyn Rhodess, introduced motive and complexity far beyond a simple slipping accident. The financial conspiracy. The prenuptial trap and the $50 million insurance payout were now completely irrelevant. Malcolm was facing attempted murder. He tried one last desperate attempt at narrative control. Quentyn is irrelevant. He's obsessed with her. She's pregnant with my child. She's delirious. Officer, I need to speak to my legal team about the separation agreement, Mr. Vance. The lead officer interrupted, her tone now cold and authoritative. We have multiple witness statements indicating a physical altercation and a possible shove. We have an injured conscious victim who has already named you as her assailant. And we have the building manager confirming that a security footage deletion was ordered. The room was silent, save for Tanisha's frantic hushed denials to a nearby socialite. The officers had already begun collecting preliminary statements. And the truth, fueled by the sheer terror of Malcolm's earlier threats, was pouring out. The lie was exposed. The final decisive blow came not from the police, but from the arrival of the building manager, who approached the lead officer with a tablet. Officer, I confirmed the details on the car. It's registered to Quentyn Rhodess. And due to a system glitch during the deletion attempt, the balcony footage is currently being restored. I believe the full sequence of events will be available within the hour. Malcolm stood isolated in the center of the room, surrounded by the ruins of his opulence. The red and blue lights flashing on his face were no longer festive. They were condemnatory. The image of his triumphant control had fractured beyond repair. The perfect Christmas lie had crumbled under the weight of a $50 million betrayal and the improbable durability of a well-maintained GT belonging to the only man who still truly cared about the woman he tried to kill. The $50 million prenup clause was now null and void, replaced by the inevitability of justice. Imani was alive. Her story was out. And the man who pushed her off a 5-story building now had nowhere left to fall but into the hands of the law. The previous moments of chilling realization, the overheard insurance policy, the desperate state of Malcolm's finances, and the ironclad nature of the prenuptial clause had all served as the prologue. Now, as the biting wind whipped around Imani's face on the penthouse balcony, the script shifted immediately to the climax. The moment Malcolm's face drained of color. Realizing Imani knew about the $50 million policy was the point of no return. It was the instant the controlling husband shed his facade and the murderer revealed himself. You should have stayed silent, Imani. You should have played your part. This wasn't merely a statement of regret. It was a furious admission of his monstrous intent. Malcolm had designed her death to look tragic and accidental, securing his fortune. Her knowledge had invalidated the entire calculated scheme. The silence between them was thick, charged with the energy of a lightning strike waiting to happen. The cold air suddenly felt suffocating. No longer a refuge from the party, but the environment for her execution. Imani stood firm, her hand gripping the glass railing behind her, the icy metal a grounding force against the panic trying to consume her. She had endured months of his emotional erosion, its constant belittling aimed at proving her instability for the sake of the prenup. But now, faced with his confessed fatal ambition, the fear gave way to a cold, visceral fury. She was no longer fighting for her marriage. She was fighting for her life and the life of her child against a man who saw them both as mere financial calculations. You gave me a contract, Imani responded, her voice low and dangerously clear, overriding the tremble in her body. I read every word, Malcolm. Not just the part about the assets, the part about the moral turpitude, the part about the undue influence. You may control the tabloids, but you cannot control the physical evidence of your abuse, which is now a record of attempted murder. Malcolm laughed, a harsh grating sound that held no humor. It was a sneer of contempt. Abuse. You call it abuse. I call it necessary management. You needed structure, Imani. You were a chaos factor. I put you in this dress. I put you in this penthouse. I put you in my life so you could perform the role of the devoted matriarch. But you've resisted, haven't you? You rebelled against the value I assigned you." He took a step closer, crowding her space, forcing her back against the railing. His size, his sheer physical dominance, was always his primary weapon. "Look around you," he commanded, gesturing toward the glittering windows of the penthouse where their guests remained trapped in their blissful ignorance. "They see wealth, power, stability. They see my legacy. Your instability, your emotional fragility that destroys the foundation of my credit, Imani. It makes me look weak. You are not a wife. You are a liability. A $50 million liability that needs to be permanently retired." His breath smelled sharply of expensive whiskey, masking the rot of his desperation. He didn't just want her gone. He wanted to destroy the person she was, to validate his claim that she deserved her fate. "You think you're strong because you know the numbers. You think your little family trust can defeat me. You have no idea what I control. I am the architect of this city's dreams, and you are a loose thread I am cutting." The wind intensified, whipping Imani's hair across her face, briefly obscuring her vision. A momentary distraction she couldn't afford. She had to shift the focus away from the financial motive, which only he understood, to the emotional motive, which could be recognized by a witness. She looked him straight in his cold, calculating eyes. "You tried to erase Quentyn from my life, didn't you?" she challenged, injecting a sudden, unexpected subject into the battle. "You forced me to marry you because my father's business was dependent on your investment. You were always jealous, Malcolm. Not of my love, but of the fact that another man saw my worth when you only saw my price." It's the use of Quentyn's name, the mention of her past genuine connection, hit him harder than the admission of knowing about the insurance. It pierced his enormous ego. He could handle financial threats, but he could not handle the insinuation that his possession had once belonged to a rival who, in a chilling twist of fate, had parked the very car below that was about to save her life. "Don't speak that bankrupt idiot's name," Malcolm roared, his voice finally losing its practiced control, rising above the ambient noise of the party inside. He failed. He lost everything. "I built this. I earned this power. You chose me, Imani. You chose the security of the Vance name over his pitiful sentimentality." He seized her arm again, his fingers digging into the emerald silk and the soft skin beneath. The grip was brutal, a stark message of physical ownership. "You belong to me. And if I can't keep you, no one will. Especially not that sentimental fool." He didn't just push her. He initiated a sequence of violent, controlling movements designed to make her look like the aggressor, or the distressed victim losing control. He twisted her arm, forcing her body into a desperate, uncomfortable arc over the railing. Imani gasped, not just from the pain, but from the realization that this was the definitive, final moment of their relationship. The moment where he stopped being a husband and started being an executioner. "You have to choose your role, Imani," he sneered, pulling her back violently, then slamming her torso against the glass railing. "The victim who slipped, or the pathetic fool who tried to escape. Either way, the money is secured." She didn't plead for her life. She pleaded for the truth. "The balcony cameras, Malcolm. You can delete the video, but you can't erase the audio. Everything you just said, the $50 million, the prenup, the motivites, all recorded. You think only the surveillance cameras are recording tonight?" She lied, hoping to plant a seed of doubt and desperation. "I made a copy. A digital copy is in the vault, and the key is not with me." The lie about the recording key was a brilliant final act of psychological warfare, and it worked. Malcolm froze, his eyes wide with temporary paralysis. The financial motive was secondary now. The criminal evidence was everything. If she had secured a copy, if the key was external, his legal fate was sealed the moment the police started investigating. His rage became frantic, desperate. "Where is it?" he snarled, shaking her violently, the movement making her dizzy. "Where is the key, Imani? Tell me now, or I swear to God I will ensure that child never takes a breath of air." The threat against the baby was the line he should never have crossed. It was the absolute total collapse of her emotional restraint. Her survival instincts surged, amplified by the fierce maternal protection of her unborn child. She was no longer dealing with a desperate financier. She was dealing with a psychopath. "The key?" she spat back, forcing the words out despite the pressure on her chest. "Is with the only person who ever saw my worth beyond your balance sheet? And he knows to release it if I don't answer his call by 1 a.m. It was a reckless, magnificent gamble, using Quentyn as her phantom ally. Malcolm was convinced. He believed her. The panic in his eyes confirmed it. The thought of Quentyn, the ghost of her moral conscience holding the key to his criminal downfall, was too much for his monumental ego to bear. He let out a guttural roar, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury and defeat. "You are an absolute liability. You have always been a liability." His hands shifted from gripping her arms to her back, his intent now utterly clear, immediate, violent obliteration. He shoved her a tremendous, blindingly fast push, using the full weight of his anger. He wasn't aiming for her to slip. He was aiming for her to fly. Imani's heels scraped against the stone edge of the balcony. The world tilted violently. The glass rail was suddenly far below her, offering no support. The last thing she saw was the distorted reflection of Malcolm's face. Frozen in a mask of triumph and terrifying certainty, convinced that the liability had finally been neutralized. She felt the emptiness beneath her feet, the sickening disconnect from the structure, and then the terrifying, irreversible reality of the 5-story drop. The wind stole her scream as she fell into the cold, indifferent night. The Christmas party, the jazz, the wealth, the $50 million policyette all became a meaningless, distant memory in the frantic rush toward oblivion. She closed her eyes, instinctively curving her body, dedicating the final, brutal impact to save the one thing Malcolm could never truly own: her son. The fall was an eternity compressed into a few terrifying seconds. The rush of air was a physical assault, stripping away any last vestiges of the penthouse's oppressive warmth. Imani felt weightless, consumed by gravity, yet fiercely focused on the maternal imperative to shield her baby. She was utterly alone in that descent, suspended between Malcolm's malice and the unforgiving ground. But then, the black asphalt that had been rushing up to meet her was suddenly replaced by a solid, resilient black object. The impact was not a full stop, but a controlled, albeit agonizing, deceleration. The sound was a symphony of destruction screeching metal, the violent deployment of specialized high-grade automotive airbags, and the sickening groan of high-density fiberglass absorbing force. The impact slammed the air from her lungs. She felt a searing pain across her back and ribs, the violent redistribution of energy through her body, but her abdomen, her most sacred trust, was protected. She lay crumpled, disoriented, the acrid smell of burnt plastic and lubricant filling her nostrils, the insistent, hysterical wail of a car alarm screaming directly beneath her. She had landed on the hood of a car, a single, magnificent vehicle parked with impossible precision directly below the most vulnerable point of the Vance penthouse balcony. Dazed, adrenaline-shocked, she forced her eyes open. Her vision was blurred by tears and the immediate concussive trauma. But she could make out the details of her unexpected metallic savior. It was massive, low-slung, and luxurious. A vehicle clearly built with bespoke engineering. Not meant for Manhattan's dense parking, but designed for sheer power and protection. The car, an ultra-rare matte black Mercedes-AMG GT, was an impossible sight. And then, through the fragmented shards of the shattered windshield, her eyes fixed on the vanity plate. The cryptic, personalized letters that spelled out the old university nickname of a man she hadn't dared to think. Quentyn. The irony was overwhelming. Malcolm had designed her death to secure his fortune from the rival who once loved her. Yet Fator, perhaps a desperate, loving premonition, had intervened using Quentyn's single, priceless possession as her ultimate indestructible shield. It was a tangible $300,000 statement of devotion. The man who had been called bankrupt by Malcolm, the man who was supposed to be irrelevant, had just saved her life with his sheer deliberate presence. Above. The silence that followed Imani's scream was rapidly replaced by panic. The jazz band stopped mid-note. Champagne glasses paused mid-clink. The party atmosphere evaporated, leaving behind the raw, ugly truth of the tragedy. Guests rushed to the balcony, their opulent clothes suddenly seeming grotesque under the cold streetlights. They looked down, expecting the finality of death, only to be met by the deafening sound of a car alarm and the impossible sight of a crumpled, yet moving form. Malcolm stood immobilized, gripping the railing, his knuckles white. His carefully constructed narrative the accidental slip, the suicidal wife. The $50 million rescue had been utterly destroyed. The survival was bad enough. The survival on that specific car was a cosmic intervention he couldn't explain or control. He needed to act, not just to control the narrative, but to erase the evidence. The cameras. He sprinted back inside, searching frantically for his head of security. David! David! The balcony cameras. Delete the feed, all of it. The last 5 minutes. Now, blame the snow. Blame the power surge. I don't care, destroy the evidence now. He hissed, his face contorted in a mask of panic that terrified the nearest guests more than the fall itself. His accomplice, Danisha, however, was already in performance mode. She had seen the flash of panic in Malcolm's eyes and knew her role was to step into the emotional vacuum. She approached a group of influential investors near the fireplace, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. "This is devastating," Tanisha whispered, her eyes theatrically wide. "We all saw how emotional Imani was tonight. She's been struggling for months, the pressure of the pregnancy, the role of the matriarch. Malcolm tried everything to help her, but sometimes people just can't cope." She paused, letting the implication of suicide or emotional breakdown settle. He's heartbroken. He saw her slip. He tried to grab her, but the snow... She placed a comforting, proprietary hand on Malcolm's retreating back, projecting an image of the united couple facing tragedy, subtly suggesting that she was the strong, stable future, and Imani was the liability that had self-destructed. But below, the evidence was already being gathered by the very car that had saved Imani. The Mercedes MGT, a symbol of Quentyn's former wealth and continued power, was the silent, massive witness to Malcolm's crime. The fact that Quentyn had placed it there, whether by fate or by a dark, protective premonition, was about to turn a chaotic accident into a premeditated crime. The first sirens were heard in the distance, a high, lonely wail that instantly silenced the party's whispers. The lights, red and blue, began strobing through the penthouse windows, painting the opulent room with the colors of emergency and criminality. Malcolm's time for narrative control was ending. The time for accountability was beginning. He watched in frozen horror as the police and paramedics arrived on the street. The sight of Imani being carefully extracted from the wreckage of the car hood, alive and moving, was a public, devastating defeat. The fall had failed. The $50 million was now unattainable, and the prenup was useless. The only thing left was the criminal charge. The final act of the segment was the police confronting Malcolm, their faces grim and unyielding. The lead officer, unimpressed by his wealth and his panicked assertions of accident, cut straight to the core of the matter. "Mr. Vance, we have an injured victim who is conscious and has provided a statement. We also have multiple witnesses confirming an argument and physical contact immediately prior to the fall. Furthermore, we have confirmation of an attempt to delete security footage." She didn't need to ask if he pushed her. She stated the evidence against him. Malcolm's face crumbled. The mask of the powerful financier finally shattered, revealing the desperate, failed murderer beneath. The only words that escaped him were a final, frantic attempt to cling to his ruined script. "She was unstable. She was a liability, not a wife. I was protecting the assets." The officer nodded slowly, confirming the depth of his malice. "Your liability, Mr. Vance, is now a witness. You are under arrest for attempted murder." The scene was complete. The final fatal argument had not resulted in Imani's death, but in Malcolm's total downfall, sealed by his own desperate confession and the impossible intervention of her protector's car. The $50 million lie was dead. And the truth had just arrived. The descent was not silent, but a terrifying symphony of physics and betrayal. It was the sound of Imani's gasp, the violent whisper of air accelerating past silken skin, and the sickening realization that gravity, that relentless, indifferent force, was now Malcolm's final, lethal ally. They say your life flashes before your eyes in moments of extreme peril. But for Imani, it wasn't a collage of sentimental memories. It was a rapid-fire playback of the controlling lies Malcolm had fed her, the financial spreadsheets he concealed, and the cold, terrifying certainty of the $50 million insurance policy he sought to claim. In that fall, the opulence of the penthouse became a meaningless, distant pinpoint of light. Her entire existence narrowed to one desperate primal command: protect the child. Every fiber of her being, every reflexive muscle, curved and twisted, attempting to rotate her pregnant body away from the direct, flat-backed impact. She was shielding her son from the concrete, willing her own fragile frame to be the sacrifice. The weight of the baby, which had often felt like a burden under Malcolm's critical gaze, now became her anchor, her mission, the single reason to fight the terminal velocity. Then came the impact. It wasn't the clean, skull-shattering collision with the pavement that Malcolm had envisioned. It was a jarring, complex collision that sounded less like a disaster and more like a colossal, yielding catch. A sound of expensive, high-density materials being deliberately crumpled. There was the deafening kersher of a reinforced windshield imploding, the sharp, acrid pop of a specialized airbag system firing with ballistic intensity, and the deep, tortured groan of stressed metal designed to absorb force, not deflect it. The force slammed the air from her lungs in a massive, painful exhalation. Her body was a wreck of bruises and shock, but the critical damage was mitigated. She lay crumpled across the vehicle's massive, caved-in hood, her emerald gown catching on fragmented plastic and shattered glass. The world spun in a dizzying circle of streetlights and snow, but she was breathing. The first sign of life was the relentless, hysterical wail of the car alarm, a screaming, undeniable siren of her survival that echoed off the tall buildings of Manhattan. Imani was alive, and the absurdity of her salvation was only beginning to register. She was lying on a safety net she had never installed, a fortress of steel and carbon fiber that had miraculously intercepted her trajectory. This wasn't just any vehicle. This was a bespoke, highly modified luxury sports car. A machine whose very existence below the Vance penthouse balcony was a statistical impossibility. A divine intervention dressed in matte black and chrome. The throbbing pain was a slow, overwhelming realization that she had not died, but had instead suffered a spectacular, catastrophic injury. But beneath the pain, a fierce, almost hysterical sense of triumph began to bubble. Malcolm had failed. His ultimate act of control, his murderous finale for the sake of the $50 million, had been sabotaged by a metallic guardian. She forced her head up slightly, the movement sending blinding pain through her neck. The sheer cost of her cushion was evident in the wreckage around her. The hood, designed to be rigid, had buckled and compressed with deliberate precision, forming a deep, protective cradle around her torso and shoulders. The specialized windshield, meant to resist fragmentation, had failed dramatically, spraying crystalline shards, but its multi-layered design had absorbed an incredible amount of kinetic energy. This was not a standard sedan. It was a fortress on wheels, an engineering marvel dedicated to speed and, ironically, extreme occupant protection. The car alarm was relentless, an attention-grabbing sound that cut through the silence of the snow-covered street and screamed directly up to the penthouse where Malcolm stood, panicked and defeated. It was a sound that guaranteed witnesses, police, and media attention, the very chaos Malcolm had tried to avoid with his calculated suicide narrative then. Through the haze of shock, her eyes found the vanity license plate. It was not a corporate plate or a random number. It was a private plate customized years ago during a flush of giddy, youthful wealth. Reading simply, Kuman GT. The sight of those letters was more impactful than the fall itself. It was the confirmation of the ridiculous, terrifying, magnificent truth. Quentyn Rhodess, the ex-fiancé Malcolm despised, the man whose name was forbidden in the Penthouse. The former tech billionaire Malcolm had successfully painted as a bankrupt sentimentalist, was the owner of the $300,000 safety net that had just saved her and her child. The sheer poetry of the moment was breathtaking. Malcolm Vance, the man who prided himself on controlling every financial variable, every asset, every outcome, has been undone by a piece of personal property belonging to the one person he couldn't corrupt or destroy. Quentyn's car, a testament to the wealth he still possessed, had acted as the material manifestation of his protective love. Imani realized then that this was no mere coincidence. Quentyn was meticulous, almost pathologically organized. He did not park a car of this value a vehicle he treated almost like a museum piece, randomly on a snow-covered street in front of his rival's penthouse. His presence, or at least his car's presence, felt less like an accident to fate and more like a deliberate, preemptive intervention. Had he been watching? Had he suspected Malcolm's desperation and the sinister timing of the $50 million policy? The question swirled, but the answer was irrelevant to the fact. Her life was now owed to him. The first faces appeared over the ledge of the penthouse balcony, looking down with a mixture of horror and fascination. They saw not a broken body, but a woman stirring amongst the wreckage of a car. Their whispers, faint and distant, were replaced by the urgent voices of the first people reaching the scene on the ground, a few confused party attendees who had rushed downstairs, and a security guard from a neighboring building. The security guard, already on his radio, relayed the impossible scene. "We have a fall victim. Female, pregnant, fell from the Vance penthouse, alive, landed on a black Mercedes. Severe impact to the car. Need EMS immediately." Imani tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling gasp escaped her throat. The pain in her ribs was intense, making every breath a shallow, agonizing effort. But she focused on the sirens now wailing in the near distance, their sound growing louder, promising not just medical attention, but accountability. She had survived, and the survival meant Malcolm's narrative of the suicidal, hysterical liability was instantly shattered. The arrival of the first paramedics was a sudden burst of controlled urgency. Their movements were precise, their voices calm and direct, cutting through the general panic. They stabilized her neck, assessed the trauma, and began the meticulous process of extraction. As they gently worked, their primary focus was, correctly, the viability of the pregnancy. The first paramedic, a woman named Sarah, leaned close to Imani's face, her light shining into Imani's eyes. "Can you hear me? You are incredibly lucky. We are getting you out. Do you know what happened?" Imani forced her lips to move, the dry, cracked feeling in her throat making speech agonizing. But the truth had to be spoken before Malcolm's lies could take root. "Malcolm pushed me. He pushed me." The words were weak, but Sarah's face changed instantly from clinical assessment to grim determination. This was no accident. This was a crime. "Malcolm Vance, your husband." Sarah clarified, her voice barely a whisper. Imani could only manage a slow, painful blink in confirmation. The paramedic immediately relayed the information to her partner via headset. Victim states deliberate push by the husband. "Malcolm Vance. Alert police at the scene. Secure the husband immediately." The rapid shift from rescue operation to crime scene investigation was palpable. The arrival of the police, signaled by the harsh red and blue strobe lights now bathing the entire street in an urgent, frantic glow, meant that the evidence of the $300,000 safety net would not be overlooked. The police, already aware of the attempted deletion of the security footage from the penthouse, would connect the dots instantly: the financial motive, the recorded shove, the planned destruction of evidence, and the miraculous, high-value survival on a car belonging to a known party outside of Malcolm's influence. As they finally managed to gently lift Imani off the crushed hood, transferring her to the gurney, the true extent of the car's sacrifice was visible. The Mercedes-AMG GT was totally unrecognizable in the front of glorious, expensive ruin. It had performed exactly as its high-spec engineering intended, sacrificed entirely to save the human life it encountered. It was a spectacular monument to the value of Imani's life, a value Malcolm had criminally underestimated. The journey in the ambulance was a whirlwind of beeping monitors, hushed voices, and urgent medical procedures. Imani was fading in and out of consciousness, anchored only by the constant, rhythmic assurance of the fetal monitor confirming the continued tenacious heartbeat of her son. He is safe. We both made it. That singular truth was the only thing that mattered. She heard the paramedics speaking about the owner of the vehicle, Quentyn Rhodess. They mentioned his full name, his former business history, and the shocking coincidence that his car, often kept under lock and key, was parked in that precise, impossible location. The irony resonated deeply within Imani's shock-addled mind. Malcolm's ultimate crime was thwarted by the physical presence of the very man he considered a failure. A man he had mocked for being too sentimental. Quentyn's supposed bankruptcy had just saved her life with a $300,000 machine. Suddenly, the ambulance doors flew open and a blast of cold air rushed in, accompanied by the sight of a familiar figure. Quentyn Rhodess himself was there. Having somehow tracked the emergency frequency, or simply followed the ambulance to the scene. He was disheveled, covered lightly in snow, his face pale and etched with raw terror and profound relief. "Imani," he breathed, rushing to her side, ignoring the protests of the paramedics. He gripped her hand, his touch warm and real, a shocking contrast to the trauma she had just endured. "I saw the scene. I knew it had to be you. My car, it was there. Are you all right? The baby?" His questions were frantic, genuine, devoid of any of Malcolm's transactional concern. "He pushed me, Quentyn," Imani whispered, her voice stronger now, fueled by his presence. "For the $50 million. He thought I was a liability." Quentyn's face hardened, all relief draining away, replaced by a cold, devastating fury. He looked down at the hand he held, then back at Imani's battered, courageous face. His car was not just a shield. It was an active witness, a statement of his unwavering protective stance. "He won't get away with it, Imani," he vowed, his voice low, steady, and utterly determined. "He will pay for this. I promise you, he will pay for every lie, every insult, and every inch of damage he has done to you." Quentyn's presence was not just emotional support. It was strategic. He immediately began coordinating with the police officers now surrounding the ambulance, providing his full contact information and, crucially, confirming his relationship with Imani and his absolute certainty that Malcolm had intended to murder her. His statement, backed by his high-profile credibility, provided an immediate, decisive counter-narrative too. Malcolm's desperate lies about a slip on the snow. The police were informed of the car's registration, the timing of the fall, and the specific chilling details Imani had provided. The combination of the attempted evidence destruction in the penthouse, the victim's immediate identification of her assailant, and the timely, impossible presence of a high-value third-party asset acting as a shield, created an undeniable case of attempted murder fueled by financial motives. The era of Malcolm Vance's untouchable power had ended on the hood of Quentyn Rhodess's prized vehicle as Imani was wheeled into the bright, sterile environment of Mercy General Hospital. The noise and chaos finally began to recede. Quentyn walked alongside the gurney, his presence a warm, immovable anchor. Malcolm's world had relied on her death. Quentyn's presence cemented by the $300,000 safety net. assured her survival, her justice, and her freedom. She looked at Quentyn, her tired eyes reflecting an immense gratitude. The fall was over. The physical recovery would be long and brutal. But the psychological scars of Malcolm's control were already beginning to fade. Her life had been saved by the man who valued her worth over her price, and by a spectacular, expensive miracle that no insurance policy could ever cover. The final fatal argument on the balcony had led not to her grave, but to a new beginning, protected by the most unlikely and most perfect of shields. The scream of the car alarm below was a relentless, high-pitched verdict echoing through the Vance penthouse. It was the sound of Malcolm Vance's definitive failure. He stood rigid by the balcony door, the cold wind rushing in, his expensive, custom-made suit suddenly feeling like a prison uniform. His initial shock had curdled into a cold, murderous panic. The fall was supposed to be silent, final, and tragically dismissible as an accident. Instead, it was a spectacular, noisy spectacle guaranteed to draw every eye in Manhattan. His first, most crucial action was not to call for help, but to frantically attempt to erase the crime. The 911 call that never happened was Malcolm's first, most telling indicator of his guilt. His concern was not the life bleeding out on the street 5 stories below, but the $50 million policy he was about to lose and the impending collapse of his meticulously curated image. If Imani died, he controlled the narrative. If she lived, the narrative was hers, and he could not afford her to speak. He scanned the room. The music had died, leaving behind a terrified, stunned silence. Guests, once his admiring audience, were now witnesses, their faces pale under the glittering Christmas lights. Malcolm knew that in a room full of financiers and political figures, fear was the most potent currency. He had to regain control of the room before the police arrived and before the truth of the black Mercedes registered. He strode into the center of the room, his movements tight and deliberate, projecting a facade of concerned authority. He stopped beside the giant, glittering Christmas tree, its light reflecting unnaturally in his strained eyes. "Everyone, please," he commanded, his voice unnaturally loud, cutting through the murmuring panic. "There has been a terrible accident. My wife, Imani, in her distressed state, slipped on the icy balcony railing. I tried to reach her, but it was too late." He emphasized the words distressed state and slipped with calculated precision, planting the seeds of his official story. He played the part of the heartbroken, overwhelmed husband, running a hand through his hair with practiced desperation. But his eyes, cold and restless, betrayed the performance. Darting frantically towards the security office hallway, his lack of concern for Imani's status was startling. He spoke of the accident as a problem of public relations, not a medical emergency. "I need everyone to remain calm," he continued, his voice hardening into a clear threat. "The police will be here and we must be unified in our account. This was a terrible accident caused by the dangerous weather and my wife's documented emotional fragility. Any deviation from this fact will be viewed as slander against my family during a time of crisis." The threat was subtle, yet devastatingly effective. These were people dependent on his investments, his political favor, or his social standing. His words weren't just a request for silence. They were a demand for complicity. He leveraged the very social hierarchy he had created. To contradict Malcolm was to invite ruin. Most of the room immediately lowered their gazes, silently accepting his version of events out of self-preservation. They became a forced, fearful jury, ready to rubber stamp his verdict. But Malcolm knew that human testimony was unreliable. Digital evidence was not. He sought out David, his head of security, who was nervously attempting to restore order near the chaotic balcony. He pulled David into a dark service corridor, his voice dropping to a sharp, menacing whisper. "The balcony feed, David, and the cameras pointing to that area. Delete them, now. Every second of the last 5 minutes. Wipe the server clean. Call it a power surge. I want that data gone before the police even step out of the elevator." David, pale and shaking, swallowed hard. "Sir, I already started trying." But the system is complex. The exterior cameras automatically back up to an off-site server. And if the police request the data log, the deletion itself will be recorded. It's a felony, sir. Malcolm's fury erupted, a silent, volatile shockwave in the confined corridor. He didn't raise his voice, which was far more terrifying. You worry about felonies, David? I am worried about criminal indictment. I am worried about losing everything because of one liability's final act of rebellion. You are paid handsomely to handle technical difficulties. You have 10 minutes. Fail me, and you won't just lose your job. You'll lose your license, your pension, and your reputation in this city. Do you understand the value of your silence? David, trapped between his professional ethics and the very real threat of financial destruction, raced toward the security room. Malcolm's instructions were clear. The past, as recorded on the digital ledger, had to be erased. The 5 seconds of the push, the proof of his financial motive and his murderous intent were stored on a hard drive. A simple piece of technology holding the power to end his reign. Meanwhile, Tanisha Boyd was executing her part of the crisis management with chilling efficiency. She moved through the guests, her elegant silver gown, a beacon of composed grief, reinforcing Malcolm's narrative. She didn't discuss the fall. She discussed Amani's fragility. It's heartbreaking, isn't it? She murmured to an influential political donor. Malcolm tried so hard to keep her stable. But the pressures of the Vance name, the pregnancy. She was so unwell. He was planning to seek professional help for her immediately after the holidays. She was successfully laying the groundwork for the inevitable legal defense. The wife was unstable. The husband was caring. And the fall was a tragic, self-inflicted accident. Her performance was impeccable, weaving a tapestry of false sympathy around Malcolm's obvious, desperate guilt. But outside, the relentless car alarm continued to scream. It was an auditory anchor pulling the truth away from the lies being spun inside the penthouse. That alarm and the visible, spectacular wreckage of the car proved that this was a catastrophic, high-impact event that required investigation, not a quiet dismissal. Malcolm, pacing near the elevator, felt the walls closing in. He pulled out his phone, not to call an ambulance that was already being handled by the street witnesses, but to call his lead litigation attorney. His conversation was hushed, frantic, and entirely focused on the prenuptial agreement. She's alive, Thomas. Barely, but she's alive. I need a separation motion filed immediately, citing grounds of severe emotional instability. We need to lock down the assets before she can speak. And that $50 million policy, if she dies in the hospital, the accident narrative holds, right? We must make sure the documentation supports the accidental claim. The frantic conversation revealed Malcolm's total commitment to his initial goal. He was not mourning. He was maneuvering. The only value Imani held for him was her death, and he was already calculating the final few hours of her life, hoping for a medical failure that would secure his fortune as he finished the call. His eyes fell upon a young couple near the balcony. They were whispering, their faces etched not with fear, but with a quiet, certain horror. He recognized the woman. She was the daughter of a rival investor. He had threatened her father during a tense negotiation a few months prior. He approached them, forcing a look of sorrow onto his face. Are you all right, my dears? This has been a terrible shock. My wife. The young woman looked up, her gaze steady, refusing to be intimidated. We saw her reach out, Mr. Vance, she stated, her voice quiet but firm. She wasn't falling. She was struggling. And we heard the argument before the music stopped. Malcolm felt a cold dread sink into his stomach. A direct, non-compliant witness. He leaned closer, his voice dropping below the level of the surrounding chatter. You are mistaken, child. You are clearly distraught. Do not confuse panic with fact. If you repeat such lies to the police, I will ensure your father's business suffers the consequences of his daughter's recklessness. You understand the political and financial implications of slander. The threat was clear, effective, and profoundly incriminating. He wasn't comforting a distressed witness. He was engaging in active, calculated witness intimidation, a felony layered upon the attempted murder. The young woman flinched, her friend pulling her back nervously, but her gaze held his for a moment longer a small. Silent defiance that Malcolm would not forget. Malcolm retreated, his rage a contained, burning poison. The human witnesses were cowed, but the digital witness remained the largest threat. He sought out David again, finding him in the security room, hunched over a bank of monitors, his face white with stress. "Is it gone?" Malcolm demanded, his voice trembling with urgency. David looked up, his eyes meeting Malcolm's with a mixture of fear and resignation. "Sir, I couldn't. I erased the primary log, but the system's tertiary backup the offsite drive automatically initiated a restoration protocol the moment I tried to delete the original file. The balcony feed for the last 10 minutes is secured and restoring. It's recoverable, sir. And my deletion attempt is logged." The news landed like a death sentence. The crucial evidence, the video proof of the push, of the fall, and of his exact location, the undeniable truth of his crime was not erased. It was preserved, cataloged, and backed up by the very technology he had implemented to protect his assets. The digital trail of his failure was now locked in the system. Malcolm stared at the monitor, his entire body rigid. He had worried about the $50 million and his public reputation. Now he was facing prison, life without the control he craved, all because of an automated backup procedure. His attempt to erase the past had failed spectacularly, leaving an even deeper digital record of his criminal intent. The sirens outside were now immediate deafening. Red and blue lights flashed violently through the glass walls of the security room. The police were in the building's lobby, and they were coming for him. Malcolm stormed out of the security room, putting his mask back on. The practiced expression of the overwhelmed, grieving husband. But the mask was thin, brittle, unable to conceal the absolute terror churning beneath. He knew the restored footage would confirm every word Imani was telling the paramedics. He knew the young witness would be emboldened by the arrival of the authorities. He was exposed, his lies stripped bare. He walked calmly toward the elevator, where the first two uniformed officers were stepping out, their faces devoid of emotion, their eyes immediately assessing the chaotic room. "Officers," Malcolm began smoothly, extending a hand, "thank you for coming. It was a terrible accident." My wife, Imani Vance, the lead officer, cut him off, her voice level and professional. "Mr. Vance, we are aware of the situation. We have preliminary statements regarding a physical altercation and an attempt to destroy evidence. And we have confirmation that the victim is conscious and has named her assailant. We also have confirmation of the car that broke her fall. It belongs to Quentyn Rhodess. It's the name of his rival, his despised predecessor, sealed the moment of his public defeat." Malcolm had tried to erase Imani, erase the video, and erase his motives. But the past was not gone. It was simply waiting to be played back. The 911 call that never happened proved his guilt, and the recovered security footage was about to become the final, definitive proof of his crime. He was silent, unable to offer another lie, another threat, or another denial. The man who had controlled everything in his life markets, contracts, and people was now completely powerless. A prisoner of the truth he had tried so desperately to bury 5 stories below. The sound of the car alarm, now slowly fading as Imani was rushed to the hospital, was replaced by the cold metallic click of handcuffs in the chaotic, neon-drenched environment of the ambulance, with the relentless beep of the heart monitor and the smell of antiseptic filling the air. One fact transcended the physical trauma. The $300,000 safety net was not a coincidence. It was a calculated protective barrier. The moment Imani heard the name Quentyn Rhodess confirmed by the police, her shock was replaced by a deep, unwavering conviction that her ex-lover hadn't just happened to park his rare, matte black Mercedes GT directly beneath the Vance penthouse. Quentyn was a man of immense foresight and strategic thinking. He did not leave a vehicle of that value vulnerable on a Manhattan street unless he had a purpose, a profound, urgent reason. The question wasn't how she survived. The question was, why his car, his prized possession, was in that exact impossible spot, 5 stories below the scene of her near-dash murder. To understand the answer, one had to revisit the cold, transactional nature of the 3 years Imani had spent in Malcolm's golden prison. Malcolm had spent that time systematically dismantling every aspect of Imani's former life, meticulously erasing her connection to Quentyn. He had dismissed Quentyn as the sentimental bankrupt, a former rival whose tech empire had suffered a major downturn right around the time Malcolm finalized his hostile takeover of Imani's father's business, deal that forced Imani into the marriage. Malcolm had reveled in the belief that he had acquired Imani, symbol of Quentyn's lost love and a valuable piece in his own social collection. But Malcolm never understood Quentyn. Quentyn's loss of fortune had never equated to a loss of influence or intelligence. He had simply gone quiet, retreating from the public eye to rebuild, watching the market and, crucially, watching Imani. And it was his watchful, protective determination that had placed that car there. Quentyn knew Malcolm was crumbling. In the weeks leading up to the Christmas gala, Quentyn had been leveraging his contacts in the financial sector, listening to the panicked whispers surrounding Malcolm's over-leveraged holdings and the imminent collapse of his primary fund. Quentyn, the master strategist, realized that Malcolm's financial ruin would lead to a desperate, violent act of self-preservation. Malcolm was the type of man who would burn the house down, rather than surrender an asset, but the final piece of the puzzle, the key to realizing Imani was immortal. Danger came just 48 hours before the party. Quentyn's team, utilizing sophisticated public and private data analysis, flagged a sudden massive $50 million life insurance policy taken out by Malcolm on Imani, timed suspiciously to the prenuptial clause's critical deadline. The policy wasn't a standard protection measure. It was a liquidation plan, a clear signal that Imani's value to Malcolm had shifted from wife to payday. The convergence of Malcolm's financial collapse and the execution of the new policy was the undeniable siren Quentyn heard. He knew the risk was not separation, but immediate fatal violence disguised as an accident. Malcolm needed the money fast, and Imani's tragic fall on a snowy night was the perfect, plausible cover story. Quentyn did not call the police. He knew Malcolm's influence would neutralize a mere wellness check. He chose a more audacious physical intervention. He knew the general location of the Penthouse's private balcony, the place Malcolm often retreated to for secretive phone calls. He knew Imani often sought refuge there. He calculated the single most probable point of impact beneath that balcony, counting for wind, snow, and the building's facade. The black Mercedes-AMG GT was more than a status symbol. It was built with a specialized, reinforced, carbon fiber chassis and a state-of-the-art collision absorption system designed for high-speed impact survival. It was, quite literally, the perfect, expensive cushion. Quentyn drove the car himself late that afternoon, parking it meticulously at the exact coordinates of his prediction, directly beneath the Vance penthouse balcony. It was a quiet, desperate act of protective engineering. He then waited, concealed across the street, watching the gold-lit windows, prepared for the worst, hoping his timing and his calculations were perfect. He placed his own life on hold, becoming a silent, 5-story guardian. And when Imani's scream finally cut through the festive noise, when he saw the dark silhouette drop into the void, Quentyn didn't hesitate. He wasn't surprised. He was resigned to the execution of his prediction. The resulting crunch and the blaring car alarm were not signals of loss to him, but proof that his protective measure had worked. He had exchanged $300,000 of meticulously preserved assets for the chance to save the only woman he ever loved. As Imani was rushed to Mercy General, Quentyn was already working, coordinating with the police who were still outside the penthouse. He didn't just provide his name. He provided the context. "The car is mine. I know it's unusual," Quentyn told the lead officer, his voice calm amidst the chaos. "But you need to know why it was there. Malcolm Vance is facing financial ruin. I have documents that show the collapse of his fund is imminent. He recently purchased a massive life insurance policy on my ex-fiancée, Imani Harper. The car was there because I knew he would try to kill her to save himself. Quentyn's statement was a goldmine for the police. It immediately elevated the case from simple domestic violence to a premeditated, capital crime driven by high-level financial fraud. The police now had the motive, the $50 million. The means, the push confirmed by Imani's statement and the restored security footage. And the powerful, independent witness, Quentyn, whose car testified to Malcolm's exact, lethal prediction. The officers who were upstairs confronting Malcolm and Tanisha were now equipped with the full, devastating context. They understood that Malcolm's desperate threats and his attempt to cite Imani's instability were not just denial, but part of the execution of his criminal plan. Quentyn's intervention had not only saved Imani's life, but had fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. This was the ultimate revenge against Malcolm, not through financial warfare, but through an act of selfless, intelligent protection that utilized the very tools Malcolm valued: money, technology, and strategic timing against him. Malcolm, the man who saw every relationship as a transaction, had been utterly defeated by genuine, enduring love manifesting as a $300,000 safety net. The significance of the car was further cemented when the building manager, David, reluctantly spoke to the officers on the street. David confessed that Malcolm had specifically warned the building staff about suspicious vehicles parking near the curb earlier that evening, singling out the matte black GT, fearing it belonged to a reporter or a rival. Malcolm's paranoia had registered the threat, but his ego had dismissed it as a nuisance, not a life-saving shield. His attempt to have the car towed earlier in the evening had been thwarted only by a slow security response time. Later, as Imani was stabilized in the hospital, the extent of Quentyn's meticulous foresight was revealed. Quentyn sat by her bedside, holding her hand, his eyes tired but fiercely protective. He explained that he hadn't just guessed the location. "I know Malcolm," Quentyn whispered, his voice thick with controlled emotion. "I knew his pattern. He always takes calls on the north-facing balcony when he's stressed. It's the most private view. And when I saw the insurance flag, I knew. It wasn't about filing divorce papers, Imani. It was about securing the $50 million before the market knew he was sinking. Your life was his final asset." Admitted to driving the car there himself, checking the structural integrity of the hood, and ensuring its position provided the maximum possible cushioning for a free fall from that height. It was an act of engineering, fear, and enduring devotion, all wrapped into a single expensive package. He had sacrificed his prized possession for her. "I couldn't just stand by," Quentyn confessed. "I gave you up once because your father forced your hand, and I respected your decision to enter that marriage even though it broke me. But I swore I would never let Malcolm harm you. I built that car to be fast, but last night I realized I must have built it to save you." Imani's tears were not of pain, but of profound gratitude and overwhelming relief. She realized she had not been fighting Malcolm alone. Even in her darkest, most isolated moments in the penthouse, she had been watched over, protected, and strategically defended by a love that transcended the financial manipulation that had separated them. The presence of the black Mercedes GT was the tangible, physical symbol that severed Malcolm's power entirely. It was the witness that could not be threatened, deleted, or manipulated. The police now had irrefutable evidence of premeditation, driven by Quentyn's financial data and the car's impossible location. The image of the crushed, yet intact luxury car became the unofficial, defining photo of the entire case. It represented the moment a life, valued only for its $50 million insurance payout by one man, was saved by the $300,000 asset of another, a man who saw her inherent worth. Malcolm had sought to erase Imani's past and her connections, but her past in the form of Quentyn's unwavering loyalty had literally broken her fall and secured her future. Imani looked at Quentyn, the man who had traded his prized possession for her life. The fall was over. The physical recovery was just beginning. But the knowledge that her savior was not coincidence, but calculated strategic love, gave her the strength she needed to face the next battle. The battle for justice, and the battle to reclaim her life and her son, protected now by a powerful ally and the most unique safety net Manhattan had ever seen. The true enemy in any house is rarely the obvious foe. It is the person who pretends to be your ally while sharpening a knife behind your back. For Imani, that enemy was Tanisha Boyd, the woman Malcolm kept in orbita, beautiful, ruthless social climber who was always ready to step into the role of the devoted matriarch the moment Imani faltered. Tanisha's loyalty was not to Malcolm's heart, but to his ledger. And the moment Imani fell, Tanisha saw her window open. She didn't just want Imani's husband. She wanted to steal Imani's entire life, her status, her home, her influence, and even chillingly, the child Imani carried as the car alarm screamed below, and Malcolm retreated from the balcony, paralyzed by the failure of his $50 million plot. Tanisha stepped into the vacuum of control. She glided through the horrified guests, her silver dress shimmering, projecting an aura of composed, tragic compassion. This was her audition for the role of the new Vance wife, the stable, supportive partner who could handle the crisis, the fragile, Imani. Could not Tanisha approach the small groups of whispering guests, strategically planting the narrative Malcolm desperately needed? She didn't speak of the fall. She spoke of sadness. It's devastating, she murmured to the wife of a key investor. Malcolm tried so hard to keep her level. You know how emotionally volatile Imani has been since the pregnancy. He was walking on eggshells, planning to get her long-term care after the holidays. This whole tragedy, it's the culmination of her deep instability. Her language was carefully calibrated to discredit Imani completely, fulfilling Malcolm's prenup requirement that Imani be proven mentally incapacitated by painting Imani as a reckless, hysterical liability. Tanisha ensured that Malcolm's assets would be protected, thus securing her own pathway into his powerful, though crumbling, financial domain. Her next move was more brazen, crossing the line from gossip to calculated sabotage. She strategically engaged with a group of women who, she knew, were fascinated by her closeness to Malcolm. Tanisha pulled out her phone, showing a photo, not explicitly displaying it, but holding it just long enough for the nearest woman to see. The photo was a recent, intimate snapshot of Tanisha and Malcolm during a supposed business trip. His hand resting possessively on her waist, their faces close, the air thick with inappropriate familiarity. I can't imagine how Malcolm is going to cope alone. Tanisha sighed dramatically, slipping the phone away. He leans on me so much for emotional support. We've been working so closely together on business for months. He's not alone. The message was clear. Imani was the past. Tanisha was the stable, competent future. The women immediately began whispering, transforming Imani from a victim of abuse into a scorned, unstable wife who had thrown herself off the balcony in a fit of jealous despair over Malcolm's true emotional connection. The power of the confidant's kiss, the secret. Acknowledged betrayal was now doing Malcolm's dirty work better than any lawyer could. But Tanisha's ambition extended beyond merely replacing Imani as the wife. She wanted the heir. She had overheard Malcolm's frantic discussion about the legal need for a legitimate heir to secure certain estate trusts. And she knew the Vance name was paramount. If Imani and the baby survived, Tanisha had a backup plan. She would position herself as the tragic baby's de facto mother, the stable female presence needed to raise the Vance heir following Imani's inevitable long-term incapacitation. She would steal the most precious part of Imani's life, her child. The arrival of the police and the paramedics, signaled by the flashing red and blue lights, intensified Tanisha's performance. She raced to Malcolm's side, placing a hand on his arm, presenting a united front of grieving stability. "Stay strong, my love," she whispered loudly enough for the police to hear as they entered the room. "We will get through this. You did everything right. This was not your fault." Her use of "my love" was a deliberate public declaration of their intimacy, designed to suggest they had already transitioned into a formal partnership, thereby further undermining Imani's status as a relevant witness or a valid wife. She was trying to secure her prize before the body count was even confirmed. However, the moment the paramedic announced Imani was alive and had named Malcolm as her assailant, Tanisha's manufactured composure fractured. The truth of Imani's survival was a catastrophic blow to her entire plan. An alive, conscious Imani meant the $50 million insurance was lost. The prenup clause was contestable, and her narrative of fragile instability was immediately refuted by the victim's own testimony, when the paramedic added the crushing detail that Imani had asked for. Quentyn Rhodess' Tanisha's carefully constructed performance collapsed completely. "No, no, that's impossible." Tanisha shrieked, tearing her hand from Malcolm's arm. Her voice was high, frantic, and entirely unscripted. Why would she call that loser? He's bankrupt. This is a lie. She's lying to destroy Malcolm. Her sudden emotional outburst was the first crack in Malcolm's united front. And the guests, already suspicious, seized the moment to retaliate for Malcolm's threats. The political donor Tanisha had just confided in pointed directly at her. "She's lying now, officer. 10 minutes ago, she was bragging that she and Malcolm were practically engaged. She was showing us private photos and talking about how Imani was unstable. She was helping him create this lie." The accusations, fueled by the witnesses' terror of Malcolm's intimidation, poured out. Tanisha's attempt to steal Imani's status and her future had spectacularly backfired, exposing her as a calculated conspirator. The police officers, observing her sudden shift from composed confidant to panicked accomplice, immediately turned their attention to her. When the police confirmed the recovery of the security footage, the footage Malcolm had tried to delete, arised the full depth of her peril. She hadn't just been playing the role of the replacement wife. She had actively participated in covering up an attempted murder. Her calculated pursuit of Malcolm's money had made her an accessory to a felony. Malcolm, in a final act of desperation and self-preservation, turned on Tanisha, throwing her under the bus to save himself from the witness intimidation charge. She had nothing to do with this. Malcolm shouted to the officer, "She's hysterical. She was just comforting me, but she had no knowledge of any attempt to delete files. She's twisting things. She was always jealous of Imani. She wanted my attention." His betrayal was absolute. Tanisha had tried to steal Imani's life. Malcolm repaid her loyalty by publicly sacrificing her reputation and her freedom. Tanisha stood paralyzed, watching Malcolm be led away by the officers, his face a defeated mask. Her glittering, promised future of wealth and power had vanished, replaced by the grim reality of a police interrogation room. She realized with chilling clarity that both Malcolm and Imani, the husband she wanted to steal, and the life she wanted to replace, were now her enemies. She had chased a lie, believing that Malcolm's power was absolute, unaware that Imani possessed a true, powerful ally in Quentyn. Her plan to steal the title, the fortune, and the baby had failed because she fundamentally misunderstood the difference between a transactional marriage based on price and a life saved by enduring worth. Tanisha was immediately detained by the insecto, as if you're using like a scanner APT, as if you're using like a scanner app, and it's like, we're gonna die. Like, look at this. And police for questioning regarding witness, intimidation, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Her social ascent had ended in spectacular public shame, proving that loyalty built on greed is easily broken. The matriarch's role, the beautiful life, and the protected future belonged to Imani, the survivor. Tanisha's kiss of ambition had delivered her straight into the hands of justice. The sound of the elevator doors closing on Malcolm sealed Tanisha's fate as well. Her meticulous plan to usurp Imani's life had collapsed, leaving her exposed, alone. and facing the legal consequences of aligning herself with a man who valued only himself. The true power of a victim is realized, not in physical retaliation, but in the devastating simplicity of their truth. For Imani, battered and bruised on the gurney in the back of the ambulance, that truth was a weapon far more potent than Malcolm's wealth or threats. It was a single, undeniable sentence that stripped away his gilded facade. As the ambulance screamed through the snowy streets toward Mercy General, Imani had been fighting not just the agonizing pain of her physical injuries, but the overwhelming fog of shock that threatened to steal her consciousness and with it, her voice. Malcolm's entire plan relied on her silence, her death, or her delirium. But Imani was a survivor, anchored by the rhythmic reassurance of her son's heartbeat on the fetal monitor. When the lead paramedic, Sarah, leaned in, her voice low and insistent, asking for confirmation of the assault, Imani knew the moment had arrived. She had to speak the truth before the lies of Tanisha and Malcolm's. Lawyers could neutralize her testimony as the ramblings of an unstable liability. The pain in her throat made every syllable a brutal effort, but she forced the air out, shaping the decisive statement that would instantly rewrite the story. He pushed me. Words. Just as simple, devastating words. But they carried the weight of the $50 million insurance policy, the malice of the prenuptial agreement, the threat of witness intimidation, and the absolute certainty of Malcolm's murderous intent. The impact of those two words was instantaneous and far-reaching. Sarah, the paramedic, instantly escalated the situation from a traumatic accident to a felony assault. She relayed the statement immediately to the police still at the Penthouse, providing them with the clear, conscious testimony needed to bypass Malcolm's attempts at narrative control and move directly to an arrest for attempted murder. Upstairs, those two words hit Malcolm like a physical punch. He had managed to cling to the shred of hope that Imani was unconscious, paralyzed, or delirious. The moment the officer at the Penthouse confirmed, "The victim is conscious and has named her husband as the assailant," Malcolm's world collapsed. His lawyer's urgent motion to file for separation based on Imani's instability became a joke, a clear admission of his motive and his attempt to preemptively steal the assets. The sheer audacity of the truth, spoken from the gurney, had immediately neutralized the entire expensive defense Malcolm had planned. The financial motivation was clear. The evidence was preserved. And now the victim had identified the perpetrator while lucid. But the power of the statement extended beyond the police report. It empowered every terrified witness Malcolm had intimidated. The young woman who had seen Imani reach out, the building manager who had reluctantly confessed to the attempted deletion of the security footage, they all found their courage validated by Imani's voice. They had not been imagining things. Their fear had been justified. Malcolm had lied, and Imani, through her survival, had confirmed it. The most profound effect of the two words was felt by Quentyn Rhodess. When Imani repeated the statement to him in the ambulance, her eyes locking onto his, it wasn't just an accusation. It was a plea for total comprehensive justice. Quentyn, the man who had strategically parked his $300,000 safety net to break her fall, now had the moral certainty he needed to become her primary champion. "He won't get away with it," Quentyn vowed to Imani, his voice low and fiercely determined. "I promise you, I will use every resource, every contact, every piece of information I possess to ensure his downfall is absolute. He will not keep the assets, he will not profit from your pain, and he will never touch our son." Quentyn's intervention immediately shifted the case into a high-stakes public battle. He didn't just provide a witness statement. He provided a war chest. Quentyn was able to instantly provide the police with the critical financial intelligence, the timeline of Malcolm's collapse, and the moment the $50 million policy was purchased that proved the assault was not an act of passion, but an act of calculated financial murder. The two words Imani spoke were amplified 1,000-fold by the resources of the man who truly valued her. Meanwhile, Back at the penthouse, Tanisha Boyd's desperate attempts to spin the narrative dissolved completely. Her public performance of the stable confidant was revealed as a grotesque farce. Tanisha's claims that Imani was unstable and lying for attention were instantly contrasted with the fact that the injured victim, currently being treated by medical professionals, had given a clear, direct, and legally damning statement. Her attempt to steal Imani's life had made her an accessory to a crime, and the truth had exposed her completely. The toppling of Malcolm Vance was swift and brutal. The police, armed with Imani's statement, Quentyn's financial motive report, and the physical evidence of the $300,000 wreck, moved decisively. Malcolm, arrested on the spot, was taken away in the back of a patrol car. The sheer humiliation of the arrest, witnessed by his own investors and rivals, was a public shattering of his power that transcended the criminal charges. The headlines that night, circulated immediately by the journalists attending the gala, didn't mention a tragic accident. They screamed of attempted murder, financial ruin, and betrayal. The two words Imani spoke had activated a social collapse that Malcolm had always feared more than prison itself. As Imani lay in the intensive care unit at Mercy General, finally receiving comprehensive medical care, she was surrounded by a fortress of protection. Police officers were stationed outside her door, ensuring Malcolm's desperate network could not reach her. Quentyn's legal and security teams were coordinating her recovery and her safety, ensuring she had absolute freedom and control over her narrative and her legal options. Her survival was not just physical. It was an act of profound emotional empowerment. For years, Malcolm had controlled her voice, forcing her to smile, to be silent, and to act as his perfect passive possession. In her darkest moment, she reclaimed her agency, using her voice not to plead, but to accuse. The final, decisive legal blow came as the first officers confirmed the successful recovery of the security footage from the off-site server. The footage provided irrefutable visual confirmation of the final seconds of the argument. The violent gesture, the force of the shove, and Malcolm's immediate cold retreat from the railing. The digital past, which Malcolm tried so desperately to erase, confirmed every syllable of Imani's statement. Malcolm Vance, the man who believed he was above the law, whose power was supposed to be absolute, was denied bail. He was held without privilege, facing charges of attempted murder, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. His empire, built on lies and ruthless control, was now exposed as a house of cards. Toppled by the courageous utterance of his victim, Imani's journey from a terrified tiki liability forced into silence to a protected, powerful accuser was complete. The two words she spoke were more than testimony. They were a declaration of independence, ensuring that the $50 million would never be claimed, and that her son would be born into a world free from Malcolm's malice, protected by a love and a justice far more enduring than any financial empire. The true moment of justice often requires a dramatic stage, and there was no grander setting for Malcolm Vance's destruction than his own golden prison. While Imani was safe in the ambulance, her two words, "He pushed me," had set the final inescapable trap. The final act of Malcolm's downfall required the physical presence of the man he despised, the one man who understood his financial desperation and his murderous intent. Quentyn Rhodess. Quentyn's return to the penthouse was not a sentimental visit. It was a strategic invasion, designed to expose Malcolm's lies in front of his entire network of influence. The elevator chimed, and every anxious, terrified eye in the Vance penthouse snapped toward the polished steel doors. The police had already begun gathering witness statements, and Tanisha was being questioned, but the atmosphere was still thick with the residue of Malcolm's threats. Then Quentyn Rhodess stepped out. He wore a dark, heavy overcoat dusted with snow, his demeanor radiating an intense, controlled authority that made Malcolm's frantic panic seem amateurish. He wasn't the sentimental bankrupt Malcolm mocked. He was a cold, determined force of justice. The room, moments before paralyzed by fear of Malcolm, was now paralyzed by the awe of Quentyn's arrival. His presence was a silent, powerful counter-argument to Malcolm's narrative. He walked past the clustered, whispering guests, past the disgraced Tanisha, and ignored the police. His entire focus set on the man who had tried to murder the woman he loved for $50 million. Malcolm, who had been trying to argue his way out of the attempted murder charge with the lead officer, froze. Seeing Quentyn, a living, breathing ghost of his insecurity, walk into his home was the ultimate nightmare. His face, already pale from panic, drained completely, leaving a roadmap of pure, terrified realization. Quentyn's presence confirmed the worst. Imani was alive. She had spoken, and her protector was here to execute the final vengeance. "What are you doing here?" Malcolm demanded, his voice a strained croak, desperately trying to project authority he no longer possessed. "This is a private matter. You have no right to interfere in my marriage." Quentyn stopped directly in front of Malcolm, ignoring the officers momentarily. His eyes, cold and unwavering, fixed on Malcolm with a devastating intensity. He didn't raise his voice. His quiet certainty was far more terrifying than Malcolm's shouts. "I have every right," Quentyn stated, his voice ringing with absolute truth. "Imani is safe. She is alive. And she is now telling the police what you did. I'm here to ensure you don't intimidate these guests into covering up your $50 million scheme." He turned slightly to the lead police officer, providing the definitive strategic testimony that sealed the case. "Officer, my name is Quentyn Rhodess. The black Mercedes she landed on is mine. I know Malcolm's financial position is catastrophic. He purchased a massive life insurance policy. The motive is clear. He tried to kill her to save his empire, and he's currently trying to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses to cover it up." The effect of Quentyn's testimony was immediate. It provided the police with the comprehensive strategic context they needed, the financial motive that elevated the assault to calculated criminal intent. The guests who had feared Malcolm's financial ruin now recognized Quentyn's analysis as the undeniable truth. Their loyalty, already fragile, snapped completely. Malcolm, defeated and exposed, launched into a final, pathetic barrage of insults. "You're a liar. You're obsessed. You're the bankrupt fool who lost everything, including her. You're trying to destroy me out of jealousy." Quentyn simply looked at him, completely unfazed by the projection. "I may have lost my fortune, Malcolm, but I never lost my soul. You lost yours the moment you signed that insurance policy. I knew you were desperate enough to try this. My car was there because I feared your predictable malice. You saw her as a liability. I saw her as everything." He then looked at the clustered guests, ensuring his final, devastating words were heard by every investor, rival, and partner who depended on Malcolm. "You rely on a man who saw his pregnant wife as a liquidation asset. You saw the evidence of abuse, you heard his threats, and you chose to protect your portfolios over protecting a life. The fall was an act of personal violence, but the cover-up was an act of corporate corruption. And now the truth is officially on record." The guests averted their eyes, ashamed and terrified of the public fallout. Malcolm's empire was not just facing legal charges, it was facing a complete social and financial collapse. Quentyn's strategic return had ensured that. Malcolm would not only be indicted but permanently disgraced in the very environment he valued most. The lead officer, now fully armed with Quentyn's testimony and the confirmation of the restored security footage, stepped forward, ending the verbal confrontation. She placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder, officially detaining him. Malcolm fought for a final, desperate moment of control, turning back to Quentyn, his face twitching with defeated malice. "She still has to come back here. She is still my wife. I will still control the assets." Quentyn took a single final step toward him, his voice dropping to a low, powerful growl that carried the weight of years of silent protection. He spoke the words Imani needed to hear. It's the words that signaled the definitive end of her prison. "Your control ends tonight." The silence that followed was absolute. Malcolm Vance, Manhattan's self-proclaimed architect of success, was escorted toward the elevator, his head bowed, his power dissolving with every step. He was defeated not by a government agency or a corporate rival, but by the enduring love of the man he had tried to humiliate. Quentyn watched the elevator doors close on his rival. His mission was complete. He had ensured Imani's safety, secured the evidence, and guaranteed the collapse of Malcolm's legal defense. He turned to the remaining guests, his expression softening slightly. He wasn't their judge, but he was their witness. He instructed the police to take Tanisha Boyd into custody, ensuring the conspiracy was fully dismantled. Then his attention shifted entirely to the hospital. The confrontation was over. The healing had begun. Quentyn's powerful, high-stakes return had proven that love, loyalty, and strategic planning, the very qualities Malcolm lacked, were the only things capable of defeating a financial empire built on cruelty and lies. Imani was safe. Her voice was heard, and her protector had delivered the justice she deserved. Quentyn's final words to Malcolm echoed in the empty space of the penthouse, signaling the triumphant return of honesty and worth over transactional greed. The arrest of Malcolm Vance was the climactic public spectacle, but the real victory lay not in the handcuffs, but in the definitive proof that would ensure his conviction. Malcolm's entire defense rested on denying Imani's voice and deleting the video evidence. He believed that by coercing his security chief, David, to wipe the Penthouse server, he had successfully created a fatal gap in the evidence chain, leaving the case as a mere he said, she said argument against the testimony of a fragile woman. But Malcolm's paranoia, coupled with Quentyn's calculated foresight, led to a stunning reversal. Malcolm was so obsessed with controlling the official Vance Penthouse security feed that he never considered the possibility of a secret secondary recording already in play. He didn't know that long before Imani was pushed, Quentyn had already taken steps to ensure her safety was digitally protected. The key lay in the apartment below the Vance penthouse. A month prior, sensing the escalating danger and financial desperation in Malcolm's dealings, Quentyn had quietly leased the vacant unit directly beneath Malcolm's main living area. It was an extremely expensive stealth maneuver designed not for living, but for surveillance. Quentyn didn't trust the police, nor did he trust Malcolm's tamper-proof security. He needed an independent, irrefutable record. The luxury unit Quentyn leased served as his private command center. His technicians installed a highly specialized, hidden camera system focused directly on the lower edge of the Vance balcony, angled specifically to capture any activity near the railing, as well as high-fidelity microphones that could pick up conversations on the terrace. This system was linked to an encrypted off-site server that was impervious to any internal Penthouse network deletion attempt. This was the undeniable footage Malcolm had no idea existed. This footage was not the glitchy, partially recovered file the building manager found. That was the official Vance system's backup. This was an entirely separate, crystal-clear audio-visual record, meticulously gathered and time-stamped by Quentyn's own security team as Malcolm was being fingerprinted. Quentyn's head of security was quietly delivering the primary evidence package directly to the lead detective assigned to Imani's case. The detective received a tablet containing an encrypted, complete, untampered video file labeled Vance Penthouse Balcony Feed. December 24, 23:45 EST. The detective and her team sat down to watch the truth unfold, minute by minute, confirming every syllable Imani had whispered from the gurney. The footage began with Malcolm's cold, authoritative entry onto the balcony, followed by his initial attempts to coerce Imani into returning to the party. The audio was shockingly clear. They heard Malcolm's voice, not the calm facade he projected to the guests, but the menacing whisper of a man whose financial world was collapsing. The key moments, which would later be used to secure the indictment, included the $50 million motive confirmation. They heard Imani challenge Malcolm directly about the life insurance policy, and they heard Malcolm's confirmation of the scheme and the explicit intent to use her instability to secure the assets. The witness intimidation. The recording captured Malcolm's furious reaction to Imani's lie about the key in the vault, followed by his clear threat to ensure the unborn child never takes a breath of air, proved extreme malice and depraved indifference, escalating the charge. The physical act. The video clearly showed Malcolm using both hands to forcefully shove Imani backward. Not a slip, but a violent, intentional push, followed by his immediate, cold retreat back inside the penthouse, making the undeniable footage the final nail in his coffin. The police realized that Quentyn's system had provided a level of proof that no local surveillance network could have achieved. Quentyn had not only predicted the crime, but he had systematically created the unassailable evidence needed for conviction. Malcolm's paranoia led him to destroy his own server. But what Malcolm's security guard didn't know we already had was the far more powerful, pristine records stored safely kilometers away. The footage was the ultimate strategic victory for Quentyn. He had protected Imani from physical harm with the $300,000 safety net and protected her legally with the undeniable footage. It was the perfect 1-2 knockout punch of rescue and retribution. The final piece of evidence came from the building. Manager's reluctant testimony. He confirmed that Malcolm had been excessively concerned about the unit below the penthouse, which he knew was vacant. Malcolm had repeatedly asked security to check the lower unit, fearing unauthorized entry or rival surveillance. Malcolm's extreme paranoia was driven by his fear of exposure. But that very fear ultimately led to Quentyn's highly successful counter-surveillance plan. The police used the footage and Quentyn's financial documents to quickly assemble the case for the district attorney. Malcolm's defense based on the claim that Imani was an emotionally unstable liability whose slip was instantly ruined. The clarity of the video, confirming the motive and the violence, rendered any testimony from Tanisha or any of the coerced guests completely irrelevant. They would not need to rely on shaky witness accounts. They had the cold, hard, clinking truth. The same footage was shown later that day to Imani in her hospital bed, confirming the horror of her last moments with Malcolm, but also solidifying her resolve. Seeing the violence on screen, coupled with the clear audio of his murderous intent, gave her the emotional certainty needed to pursue maximum justice. The consequences were immediate and absolute. Malcolm Vance was officially charged with attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy and destruction of evidence. His bail request was denied, citing the extreme flight risk and the irrefutable video evidence. The financial institutions that had been propping up his failing empire immediately pulled their credit lines. Upon learning of the attempted murder and the massive insurance fraud scheme, the entire Vance financial world collapsed publicly. The two words Imani spoke were the opening salvo. But the undeniable footage was the atomic bomb that delivered the ultimate satisfying justice. Malcolm's control over Imani, over his finances, and over the truth was obliterated by the quiet, meticulous revenge orchestrated by the man he mocked as a bankrupt sentimentalist. Imani's survival and Malcolm's conviction were secured by the $300,000 car and the secret surveillance system, ensuring that her life, her son, and her future were finally free from the reach of the man who saw her only as an asset worth $50 million dead. The true mark of survival is not just the breath you take after the fall, but the quality of the life you build in the aftermath. Imani's physical recovery at Mercy General was slow and agonizing, but the healing of her spirit was swift, fueled by the knowledge that Malcolm's control was definitively broken. The cold, sterile environment of the hospital felt infinitely safer than the gilded cage of the penthouse. With Malcolm denied bail and the undeniable footage securing the attempted murder charge, Imani was finally, truly free. Her days were no longer measured by Malcolm's demands or Tanisha's veiled manipulations, but by the gentle presence of Quentyn Rhodess. He was a constant protective anchor, moving seamlessly from the role of the strategic guardian to the tender caretaker. He arranged for the top medical specialists for Imani and her baby, managed the relentless inquiries from the press, and, most importantly, simply sat by her bedside, holding her hand. reminding her that her worth was priceless. Not conditional, Quentyn's commitment went beyond emotional support. He immediately secured an elite legal team to handle the divorce, ensuring the prenup that Malcolm had designed as a financial trap was rendered completely void due to the attempted murder and documented spousal abuse. The toxic Vance assets, the goal of Malcolm's $50 million plot, were now frozen, and the legal path was clear for Imani to reclaim the funds belonging to her family trust. The hospital room became the command center for Imani's new beginning. She spent hours speaking with her lawyers and police investigators, providing the deep, meticulous details of Malcolm's fraud, his emotional abuse, and Tanisha's calculated complicity. She no longer spoke as a terrified victim. She spoke as a powerful witness, determined to ensure the justice delivered was absolute and final. The financial collapse of Malcolm Vance's empire was swift. The revelation of the attempted murder and the use of corporate funds for the $50 million insurance fraud triggered multiple federal investigations. Investors already burned by his failing holdings fled, and the banks pulled their credit lines. The man who had been the architect of Manhattan's success was now the symbol of its highest-level corruption. His name ruined, his power extinguished. Justice also found Malcolm's accomplice, Tanisha Boyd, facing the irrefutable evidence of the undeniable footage and the witnesses to her intimidation. Tanisha quickly turned on Malcolm. She confessed to her role in attempting to spin the unstable wife narrative and admitted her calculated plan to steal Imani's life and title. Her pursuit of the easy wealth led to her own arrest, confirming that greed and betrayal have no true home, not even in the highest echelons of society. As Imani was discharged from the hospital, the shift in her life was absolute. Quentyn shielded her from the waiting mob of reporters, pushing her wheelchair toward a secure private residence he had prepared, not the Vance penthouse, that sterile monument to oppression, but a beautiful, quiet home overlooking the park. It was a place where she could finally breathe, a place designed for peace, not performance. Trading a toxic penthouse for a true family was more than a relocation. It was a psychological exchange. The penthouse represented Malcolm's transactional view of life, where every smile was a price paid, and every person was a liability or an asset. The new home represented Imani's genuine freedom, protected by Quentyn's loyal love and the promise of a safe, unconditional future for her son. Imani began attending physical therapy, her determination fueled by the life growing inside her. She spoke openly about the abuse, partnering with women's rights organizations to share her story not as a tragedy, but as a blueprint for escape. Her courage became a symbol of empowerment, demonstrating that even against the most powerful forces of wealth and control, the truth can always prevail. She refused to remain silent, using her platform to reclaim the voice Malcolm had tried to silence forever. The final, satisfying chapter of the legal drama came with Malcolm Vance's trial. The evidence was overwhelming. The undeniable footage played for the jury, Quentyn's strategic testimony detailing the $50 million motive, and Imani's powerful, composed testimony detailing the abuse and the violent shove. Malcolm was convicted on all counts of attempted murder and conspiracy. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, his arrogance and power finally neutralized by the absolute authority of the law. The justice was not just criminal, it was financial. The assets Malcolm had sought to secure through the prenuptial agreement were largely returned to Imani and her family trust, ensuring that the wealth he had misused would now be used to build a legacy of true independence and charity rather than control. Tanisha received a lesser sentence but was utterly ruined, her name synonymous with greed and betrayal. The two conspirators who had sought to destroy Imani found their own futures shattered. Imani's life had been shattered and rebuilt. She had traded the fear of the Vance name for the certainty of her own future. She had traded opulence for genuine connection, finding a renewed, deep relationship with Quentyn. Their bond was cemented not by shared wealth, but by shared trauma, trust, and the profound act of life-saving protection that had defined her. Survival. The story closes on a note of triumphant anticipation. Imani, resting safely in her new home, looked out over the quiet beauty of the park, feeling the strong, rhythmic kicks of her healthy, thriving baby. She was no longer defined by the liability Malcolm labeled her. She was defined by her resilience and her voice. Her son was born into safety, into a home filled with unconditional love, a home that honored her worth. The safe baby was the ultimate symbol of victory. The life Malcolm had tried to erase now flourishing, thanks to the protection of Quentyn and the justice Imani demanded. This journey from the push, off the balcony to the quiet, victory of her new life is a testament to the fact that cruelty, even when backed by immense power and $50 million schemes, is no match for truth and loyalty. Imani's life was a narrative of empowerment, proving that when the truth is spoken, the most powerful man can be toppled, and a new true family can always be built from the ashes of betrayal.